So welcome everyone to the 24th Annual Student History Conference at Bow State. So this panel is Marriage and Family. And this panel consists of three fascinating papers. So the first one is Cassare marriages on the Gold Coast. The relationship that memorized Danish men on the Gold Coast in the mid 1800s. This paper was written by McKenna Cruz. McKenna is a senior in the history department at Bow State. She is social study education, general history, and public history triple major, and a political science concentration with an African American studies minor. Starting from this upcoming fall, very excitingly, she will be attending American University to pursue her master's degree in public history. So the second paper is titled The Curious Case of Chinese Courtesan in Imperial China by JunRu. JunRu is a fifth-year dual degree student from the University of Western Ontario. His two degrees are in business management, specialization accounting, and honors specialization history. His main interests in history includes 20th and 21st century contemporary social history, global comparative history, as well as environmental history. Our third paper is titled As Straight as Can Be, a comparison of Japan and China's family and social hierarchies pre-1500 era by Alicia Fleckenstein. Alicia is a senior at Bow State University studying secondary education. She will be soon teach history or government in Indiana. She works closely with Dr. Ken Holt about on this paper. Let me just quickly talk about how we are going to proceed this panel. So each panelist will present their paper accordingly. After that, I will give short comments to each paper, and then we will collect questions from audience. And then each panelist will have 5 to 10 minutes to respond the question I give them and question from audience. And then we will use the time left to have an open floor discussion, so we can go and forth about questions you have and questions you want to further discuss. So without further ado, let's start from the McKenna's paper.
Okay, hello everybody. Like I said, my name is McKenna Cruz. I'm also currently student teaching at Muncie Central High School in a 9th grade geography and history of the world classroom. I actually kind of adapted my thesis paper into a lesson for my students, and we completed it a few weeks ago. So a lot of the things that we're talking about in my paper, I'm also going to be referencing what my 14 and 15-year-old 9th grade students noticed looking at some of the photographs and some of the primary and secondary sources that we read together. So my paper is called Cassare Marriages on the Gold Coast, the Relationships that Memorialize Danish Men on the Gold Coast in the mid-1800s by me, McKenna Cruz. Whoa, that made a weird noise. There it goes. Okay, so to start off, today, the very westernized idea of the word marriage usually becomes associated with the word love. On the Gold Coast of Africa, it meant something entirely different to the Danish men moving there for social gain, and to the African women seeking financial stability. Danish men would go to the Gold Coast to build their slave trades, needing assistance in their new environment, so they would marry the local women. This was normalized practice on the Gold Coast called Cassare marriage. Cassare marriages were normalized along the Gold Coast for many reasons, including that Danish men needed someone to look after them when they fell ill in a foreign place. They couldn't speak the language, and there was a lot of strife going on between the Danish and the local African people. African women would, in a sense, marry the Danish men in order to gain financial traction and also to have social mobility in their communities. What roles did these women play, though, in the lives of the Danish men? Looking at the diaries of Danish men, this text will argue whether or not these women were closer to prostitutes or if there perhaps was some sort of affection in these relationships. Historians lack the primary sources from these African women in the relationships, and they have been lost to history, leaving only the texts and paintings of Danish men to explain the nature of the situation. Cassare marriages along the Gold Coast of Africa in the mid 1800s played many roles in supporting Danish men. This causes historians to need to look deeper in context of what the relationship signified, whether that be as a form of prostitution or a form of slavery, a mutually beneficial relationship, or if the Danish men really did care or even have love for their African wives. So we're going to be looking at two different Cassare relationships. And the first one is going to be of Edward Carstensen. He was in Guinea from 1842 to 1850. And while there, he took a Cassare wife named Severine Brock. Here we'll be looking at the nature of the relationship, customs with the Cassare marriages, and how Brock was regarded by Carstensen. Pernille Ibsen, who is a very influential historian on this topic, found an inquiry in Carstensen's diary that states, and this girl, only 14 years, but almost full grown and very beautiful, caught my eyes. Wilkins let the mother, Caroline Trussell, be asked how much she wanted for her daughter's virginity. In this quote, it is referring to Governor Wilkins and how he was going about seeking Brock for Carstensen. It is very telling of how some of these relationships came to be and their nature. No matter how you look at this, it is an inquiry to purchase Brock for sexual acts and not necessarily for a mutually beneficial relationship. Ibsen goes further to explain that instead, he described the trading deal, as he called it, with Severine's mother as an exotic event, strange, foreign, perhaps even amusing. This is also very different than how a situation like this would have happened in Europe with a Danish woman. Danish men maybe would have expressed interest in a marriage to the father of the Danish woman, but not asked for the price of virginity. And by saying the situation with Brock's mother was exotic, it goes further to explain that this is not a tradition in Danish culture, and perhaps even shows how the Danish men regarded Africa as more savage. The traditional or the trading deal, as he called it, still shows that Brock is seen as lesser by describing the encounter as a trade. That really makes me think by calling it a trade, comparing it to the slave trade itself. Since this form of relationship was seen as a custom between the local Africans and Danish, it wasn't like a real marriage. It was a custom, not like it wasn't a licensed marriage. It is difficult to define what this is. It was not seen as a form of slavery then, at least in the eyes of the Europeans whose accounts we have, but reading these sources tells a very interesting dialogue. So this is a portrait done by the Prince of Joinville, who went to have lunch with Carstensen in Christiansborg, the port that he was the governor of, in January of 1843. I showed this painting to my students and asked them to kind of talk to me about what they noticed in it. And the first thing that they saw was how the women were bare. They asked Miss Cruz, like, why are all of the African women naked? They only have like one cloth, and that doesn't really compare to the other sources that we've looked at. Earlier in that week, we had read some snippets from Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo about Cujo Wilson, who was brought on an illegal slave ship. And in that, Cujo, it's a firsthand account written by Zora Neale Hurston. She's taking an oral history of him, but he talks about how the European people stole their clothes before they were put onto the ships to be taken to America. Like they had clothes. In this, we'll talk a little bit about it more, but it was very traditional for the women in this area to wear very vibrant colors and patterns. So this painting isn't necessarily an accurate depiction of what's going on. And when my students noticed that, I asked them, who do you think, like, what perspective is this painting in? And they were like, well, the Prince of Joinville, and we talked about how he's from France, so it's from a European perspective, and this painting definitely represents that. It shows the white power in the middle. They're in the focus, the white people are, with the African women to the side. And this also isn't necessarily what happened. So we are going to talk a little bit about that. But looking at this painting, the painting by the Prince of Joinville in France explains how Carstensen also wanted to depict African women to leaders of other countries. Carstensen wrote a letter to the King of Denmark explaining the prince's visit and explained how the Negroes performed a fighting scene of how they fight in battles and how the mulattoes, or the African women, danced and performed for the prince in order to amuse him. This shows that Carstensen was interested in showing the French prince the native culture, but was this for educational purposes or for his amusement? Using context from the previous texts, it becomes clear that this was used for the amusement of the prince as a way to show how uncivilized the African people were. Uncivilized. The painting in figure 1, so this one that we just looked at, was the prince's depiction of the experience he had while dining at Christiansburg. The painting shows a sort of racial hierarchy with its choice in positioning and colors. First, the European men in power are placed more centrally in the painting, depicting focus and status. There are many Black women who are being used as servers for the dinner, and they are all very exposed, showing again how uncivil these women were, but also how they were seen as exotic and for amusement. Brock, Carstensen's Cassare wife, was not depicted in the painting because, according to Ibsen, she was not invited to the lunch. This was for many reasons. One being that Carstensen would have been judged for his Cassare wife, since that was solely done in Africa. The Prince of Joinville was visiting. He was not immersed in that culture to have a Cassare wife. It was shunned upon with the interracial marriage in Europe. That was different in Africa. So she would have been dressed a lot differently than these women, and it would have taken away from the theatrical display that the Bear women were showing. This painting goes along with the official reports of Carstensen and how he viewed Africans as lesser, and it doesn't align with the loving entries from, like, in his diaries of Brock. So we're going to be moving on now to Wolfe Joseph Wolfe, the second relationship that we're going to be analyzing. So Carstensen is not the only record of a Cassare marriage on the Gold Coast, and he learned about them from Wolfe Joseph Wolfe and his Cassare. Carstensen lived with Wolfe Joseph Wolfe when he first got to the coast, and so he learned a lot about this culture from Wolfe Joseph Wolfe. And Sarah Malm was his wife. And he stayed with them like while he first got there. This was the beginning and shows the evolution of these marriages in such a short amount of time. Wolfe was never as descriptive as Carstensen. However, in his writings, he never used any affection either. Ibsen states that Wolfe's description of Sarah Malm is oddly detached. It sounds more like a descriptive ethnographic account than a personal description of the mother of one's child. Ibsen also notes that this description is of their wedding night, and he is still like writes of her so plainly with no emotion. So we'll look at the painting that goes along with this description in a minute. With Malm being his wife and the mother of his children, no one would think that there would be more, or people would think that there would be more descriptive writing of their relationship, just like there is of Carstensen's. The nature of their relationships seemed to be different, however, than with Carstensen and Brock. This is clear in a letter to his parents, where Wolfe never calls Malm his wife or even mentions her name. She is referred to as his mulatress and never once mentions his 3 children to his parents or his brother-in-law. Looking at this helps historians to understand that perhaps these relationships were not very popular or approved of in Europe anymore. An example of him using this language in a letter is when he said, "The one I have to thank at this time for my poor wretched life besides God is my mulattonade." While this quote seems to be more affectionate than some of the other letters that he wrote, it still does not give Malm an identity with a name or a description. Names are incredibly important, especially when talking about enslaved people, due to its ability to give them an identity and a story. Wolfe never uses her name to his family, and it takes away any personal connection that she had to him and erases her from the Danish narrative of Cassare marriages on the Gold Coast of Africa. While Wolf kept his marriage a secret from his family back home, there are many factors that show he did truly care for her and their children. Wolf took great care and paid much detail to how honored mom and like which honored her and can be seen in many ways. One being that in the evening, I would practice learning the Negro language. None of the whites here at the fort want to be bothered with learning that language. My housekeeper converses with me for an hour every evening. Here, Wolf is referencing mom as his housekeeper. And his translator describes that in the footnotes of his the diary. This is taking great care to learn language and become more accustomed to the culture, which tells of his loyalty. No other Danish men at the castle learned it, which also gave him a leg up on the trade in the castle and with the native people. He was able to cut out the middleman and his deals with his deals and go directly to the natives, which he might have grown close with being married to mom, since she had such a close relationship with the people. A lot of the people in the community were her family members, her friends, her neighbors that she grew up with. The translator also made clear that while Wolf never used the word wife to describe in his letter, he treated her as such in every sense of the word. This is evident in his last will and testament. Wolf's last will and testament was created on the 8th of June, which is my birthday, of 1842. Here he left his home grounds, slaves, and pawns to Sarah Mom and her children. This was extremely important because while most men would pay into the mulatto chest, it was actually like a law. If you had a Cassare wife, you had to pay into this chest, which was basically like retirement for these women. And that did not mean that he had to give her any property, though. He did this to be able to provide for her after he was gone. This act shows great virtue, care, and character for him to do so. One might even call it an act of love. So this is the painting that Joseph Wolf painted of his wife, Sarah Mom. When I asked my students about this picture, the first thing they noticed are her enlarged chest and buttocks, but also how small her hands and feet are and how she is barefoot. When looking closer, one of my students went up to the whiteboard and looked at it and said, "Miss Cruz, is that her hair or is that a head wrap?" And I said, "That is her hair." And his response to that was, "That's racist." And I was like, absolutely, it definitely is. So we had a really good conversation about that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that next. So looking at this painting, the painting of Mom is also significant for its portrayal of Black women and stereotypes, while also focusing on the hybridity look of Euro-African women. The first and most distinguishable fact is that the portrait is done with a lack of personality and done with a side portrait. The fact that Wolf wanted to show her body, style, and certain features shows that he wanted to portray Africans as exotic to the Europeans who had never been there. He was successful in this manner by showing her large breasts and buttocks and our very widely known stereotypes of Black women, and it is clear to see how these features were exaggerated. This was most likely due to Wolf wanting to create stark differences between European or African and Black aspects of Mom's appearance. Other stark stereotypes are the way that her hair is depicted. It is very tall and like shaped oddly for what hair would look like. And it's very overly exaggerated. The gold was mentioned in Wolf's letter and was worn by like in women's hair as beads. And that gold, it like shows the African culture with the aspect of the hybridity. Her clothes are very simple. Her breasts and buttocks are completely covered, showing civility and European style as compared to other African women as well. The colors of her clothing are also very European since they are monotone and black and white. It is very custom for women on the Gold Coast to wear very colorful and patterned attire, unlike the European women. These stereotypes and mixture of European style and African traditions in clothing and how European and Danish men saw their Cassare wives. So this is a picture of Wilhelmine Josephine Wolf. It is Joseph Wolf and Sarah Mom's daughter. When I asked my students what they saw in this photo, the first thing that they noticed was, "Miss Cruz, why does she look so white?" And they are over exaggerating, they're whitewashing her, taking her away from her African roots. It was very prominent on the Gold Coast that the lighter skin you had further into this episode of looking at Cassare wives, but the lighter that your skin tone was, the more desirable you were to the Danish men coming to the coast. So this was something that was done on purpose to whitewash her. But there also are other things that we are going to talk about in this next section. So the painting of Wolfe's daughter Wilhelmine shows a stark difference when compared to the painting of her mother, Sarah Malm. For instance, this painting is conducted showing her face and can depict emotion, whereas Malm's was a side view. This painting also seems to be done by a professional and not conducted by Wolfe himself. Since Wilhelmine was a mix of Euro-African, the painting also depicts her as more European than African and shows her skin tone as much lighter than her mother's. The portrait completely takes away all African customs and depictions, including the gold beading and other jewelry that Malm was wearing. This includes the beads in Malm's hair, which is replaced in Wilhelmine's portrait by ribbons. So you can see that in her hair, she has ribbons instead of gold beads. The portrait also takes away all stereotypes of Black women, and by taking away all African depictions of Wilhelmine, it is clear to see how women on the Gold Coast with mixed race and identity were seen as more European than African. Had she gone to Europe, however, this would have not been the same viewpoint. Seeing the evolution of Cassare women on the Gold Coast shows historians how African women continue to be treated and seen through the eyes of Europeans. So kind of comparing these two relationships and then finishing up, we're going to look at both of them. So comparing these two Danish men and their relationships with their Cassare wives shows a much different take on how relationships were seen and valued. With Courtesan, it is easy to see how in his official reports and records, he spoke very matter of fact about Cassare unions on the Gold Coast. His reports of the marriages seem to lean into the direction of purchasing, which is how the institution of slavery is run. While he did not have more affectionate words to be spoken in his while he did have more affectionate words to be spoken in his personal diary that would contradict someone's belief of him being this being a form of slavery. It is important to note that just because he had feelings for her eventually did not mean that it was not a form of slavery at some point. Wolfe, on the other hand, never seemed to have inquired about purchasing Malm. He just never spoke of her in affectionate ways. All men in these Cassare marriages, however, it is stated that monthly payments were made to the mulatto chest, were formally recorded in the company's books, a well-defined practice that men who were married and got women would monthly payments of the fund. Wolfe did this and much more, and this would be seen in his testament that we talked about. So lastly, looking at comparing the paintings also tell a very interesting history of the women on the Gold Coast and how Danish men viewed them. With Courtesan, we can see how not only Danish men viewed African women as very exotic and sometimes overly sexualized, but this also went into how other Europeans viewed women as well. African women were exotic to them, but also lesser than Europeans since they were enslaved and put to work as servers for use or for show to other men. In the case of Malm and Wilhelmine, there is a much different story. Wilhelmine is depicted to show her hybridity of African and European style and culture, while also laying out the stereotypes of Black individuals still seen and used today. Wilhelmine, however, shows how Euro-African children were widely accepted as more European, while in Africa, making them more beautiful to Danish men coming to the coast to find their own Cassares. The paintings show a stark difference compared to the writings of both men and do not show the love and affection that their personal writings do. Based off of the paintings, it is clear that when depicted, the Danish men had no romantic feelings towards their Cassares and just show the exotic or hybrid nature of the women. The paintings show a more outward look of the relationships, while the documents and writings show more complex idea and contradict themselves. So to kind of wrap this up, the topic is very complex and can be hard to grasp, but it also uses a lot of personal ideals and viewpoints to be able to create one's opinions on Cassare marriages as enslaved people or prostitutes. Looking at the evidence used in this paper, the conclusion that I have come to is that Cassare marriages are too complex to be able to judge, especially based off of the evidence and viewpoints that are documented in history. Without having these primary texts with the viewpoints of the women, it makes it hard to have these assumptions. With the knowledge that women on the Gold Coast would sometimes look for these relationships for a sense of social mobility and financial security, it makes one believe that it is more of a mutually beneficial relationship. But in the case of Courtesan and Brock, with her age and asking for her mother's inquiry to purchase her virginity, it does not seem to like that seems to be prostitution. With the complexity of this, how one chooses to categorize these relationships comes down to a case-by-case scenario and how one chooses to look at the evidence. So those are my references, and that is all that I have for you.
Okay, very good. Thank you for the presentation. Now let's move on to JunRu's paper. Thank you.
Let me just try to screen share this. And just let me know if you guys can see everything and it's all right, perfect. So hi guys, my name's JunRu. I'm from the University of Western Ontario down in London, Ontario, Canada, and it's a great pleasure for me to present to you guys today. So I'm going to be stepping a continent away from what McKenna has just talked about, and I'm going to talk about the curious case of Chinese courtesan culture, a la Dr. Seuss style alliteration. So from a historical perspective, women in China generally had a lower social status as a result of patrilineal succession laws and marriage rights. China was very male primogeniture focused, and society was dominated through a male lens. The position of women can be summed up with what Chen had once said, and he is a Neo-Confucian philosopher, very renowned during his time. To starve to death is a small matter, but to lose one's chastity is a great matter. So compounding this ideal, women were subjugated to a variety of social constraints within their system, such as female seclusion, foot binding, and in extreme cases, female infanticide, just because of the gender. So as this kind of happened, a strange social caste of women developed. Courtesans, as a social caste, existed as an outlier to dominant social rules. Despite being born to poorer families and existing on the lower rungs of the social systems, courtesans were eloquent and well educated. They served as entertainers and lovers to the gentry and nobility, but eventually developed deep connections with the government and literati, which are the educated scholars of the higher class. Understanding them from a broader historical context reveals that it was only due to the unique financial and bureaucratic conditions of Imperial China that kind of allowed this paradoxical caste of women to exist, making them incomparable to other female roles at the time, such as concubines or wives. Rather, their talents in navigating the social hierarchy of Imperial China through a combination of wit and glamour were key to their subsequent immortalization in the annals of literature, despite their humble status. So in order to understand the social role of the courtesan, we kind of have to define the job. And this requires a comprehension of the term itself and how the English language may sometimes fail to reflect this idea through a direct translation. Classical Chinese is known to have a variety of words to define women in specific roles and jobs within a given social ladder. The most common of these would refer to a courtesan as a G. And while sexual favors may be provided by a courtesan, she is first and foremost an entertainer. Chinese courtesan culture was defined by several integral points. You had to have a skill in the literary arts, comprehension in song and singing. You had to understand current trends in fashion and art, but most of all, you had to be able to integrate all these talents into one package to make yourself presentable, almost like a celebrity in some cases. So from this criteria, you can kind of assume that beyond sexual services, a courtesan was most prized for her intellect, wit, and academic comprehension of the fine literary arts. The astute observer amongst you might understand that such talent would require a lot of education and skill to nurture, and you could presume that the courtesans were perhaps daughters of nobility or members of the gentry, when it was in fact the direct opposite. So getting into the social hierarchy of it, according to the judicial regulations of Imperial China, there existed the separation of the common class into two groups, which are called Liangming and Jianming, which is up on the screen there. Liangming were free men and women in good standing for society. They were considered to enjoy all the legal privileges that a free citizen of modernity might. And there was the Jianming. The Jianming were called the debased people. Generally, they were considered to be lesser than their Liangming counterparts. And this was because this distinction was made due to the work done by the Jianming. People thought that it was either humiliating or morally distasteful in some way that it created very little benefit to society. So courtesans and prostitutes were both bundled within this jianming social category under the branch of entertainers. So in this legal definition of imperial China, this subjugated them, this subjected them to this classification, which essentially marked them as social pariahs when compared to the rest of society. The paradox in this comes that courtesans kind of operate at the elite level. So despite being legally marked as lesser or inferior, they served the gentry and were often indistinguishable from women born from these wealthy families. And this was primarily attributed to the social strata they hovered around. If the talents and the social brevity of if the talents and the social norms of the courtesan were compared to international examples, only really two come to mind. So the first one is the salonier from France during the Enlightenment and Italy, and this quickly grew across Europe. Historian Dorothy Coe writes that these were the closest European equivalent to the Chinese courtesans. These were public women who arbitrated literary and artistic tastes, but their differences are a bit too much in terms of a one-to-one comparison, because saloniers were daughters of wealthy holders of high professional offices. So in other words, these were educated women of the French gentry, and they would undergo the same training and education process as the so-called debased or lesser women within China, as the courtesans would have. So a more apt comparison perhaps would be the oiran of Edo Japan. And these were women who served a similar social role to that of the courtesan, with the highest ranking of them referred to as a taiyu. Both kinds of women, both the Chinese courtesan and the Japanese oiran, were products of an emergent culture created based on the increased economic growth and urbanization of their eras. They catered to clientele who had resources and leisure time to spend due to the success of commercialization, respectively, within each of their time periods. But the courtesans served bureaucracy and the scholarly classes more so than the merchant class. So this evidence kind of plays out into the three dynasties that we're going to look at today, through the Tang, the Song, and the Ming, which are all very important imperial dynasties in China. The Song saw an increasing amount of the educated class, which continued the traditions of the Tang. The Tang codified a lot of the culture that we were going to see, the courtesan culture. And the Ming was arguably the zenith or the peak of courtesan culture when commercialization, urbanization, and a lot of this high literary culture kind of all collapsed into one to make it really the immortalization of the courtesans. So a courtesan was often from humble beginnings, as we mentioned earlier, and were eventually gifted or picked to provide female companionship. So some people could argue that this is similar to a concubine, and a concubine was essentially a wife, a secondary wife that a man could take in imperial China. While this is a tempting assumption, there's differences between the two roles. So as we mentioned earlier, a courtesan needed to have musical skills and artistic talent. This was not required of a concubine. Additionally, a concubine was technically legally married to the family, where courtesans were not. So in the Tang legal code, the term for having a courtesan is having a concubine is a qi, and becoming a concubine was jia, and these were terms ubiquitous with marriage. As such, concubines and wives were subject to legal protections under marital law. Courtesans, however, were not subject to this legal protection, as they didn't have a marital bond with the master that they were serving. So their position in the family was the lowest, lower than a wife, lower than a concubine. So it should be noted that this meant that they had very little to no legal protections, and that the prestige of them, therefore, derived from affluence, not so much as what's legally offered. So it should be said that the literati usually obtained concubines for the purpose of satisfying sexual desire or to have more children. And this was spurred by the dominant Confucian ideology within China at the time that preached the advantages of having a big family. Conversely, courtesans were used for entertainment, companionship, or to fulfill emotional needs. And most importantly, to showcase the owner's status as a member of the elite. Courtesans were a sign of official privilege and were comparable to other prized possessions, such as a large property or wealth. Much like keeping servants to showcase power, owning courtesans gave men an opportunity to demonstrate characteristics associated at the time with official success, such as a refinement in the literary arts or aesthetic judgment. So as such, within these imperial Chinese dynasties, powerful bureaucratic entities and gentry promoted this sign of status. So it was both from a public sphere and a private sphere that this idea of courtesanship was promoted. So we're going to get to the Tang Dynasty, which was a very important step leading up to courtesan culture. The Tang Dynasty itself is a golden age in terms of Chinese history. Many developmental factors contributed to the growth of this golden age. There was unprecedented levels of foreign trade and commercial relations, as well as increasing regional stability. So this led to more social mobility, more wealth domestically, and an increased flourishing of arts and culture, which just kind of spurred the interest of the finer things in life. So more relevant to the topic at hand, this excess created and codified a court culture of courtesans, which would be carried onward into the later succeeding imperial dynasties. So the Tang Dynasty saw an organization of two types of courtesans, both within the government as well as private ownership. Government courtesans were separated into three distinct separations. So the first, you had the palace courtesans, which were regarded as professionally trained music performers. Although music was their primary responsibility, those who won the favor of the emperor would be crowned shisha, and they were rewarded handsomely and thus would provide sexual services to the emperor. Yingqi were women who specifically, these were courtesans who specifically served the military realm. So they were noted to also have the same talent for musical entertainment as well as poetry as the court courtesans. So this dissuades the notion that they're primarily utilized for sexual services, but more as feminine companionship for the military caste. Lastly, the Quan Chi were defined as official courtesans. They were assigned to a geographical location or a post. So they fulfilled the job of being sponsored courtesans who were assigned as official provision to certain officials. Rather than relocate with the official, they would have a public office, as you would think of other civil powers would have. So a notable takeaway from the existence of these government-sponsored courtesans is that despite being labeled, once again, legally inferior compared to many other civilian counterparts, they interacted and lived with the higher social strata more than they would have with the lower social stratums. Even more so, the courtesans themselves were prized in the upper echelons for more than just the sexual services, music, and entertainment they provided. And there's an example of that within the Tang Dynasty with Xue Tao, which was a military courtesan that was assigned to the entertainment house of Chen. And she was noted for being a poet, and she kept up literary and scholarly discussions with other famous academic officials, such as Liu Yuxi, Bai Juyi. And what's notable about this is these weren't just normal men off the streets. These were highly esteemed literati for their time and era. They were known to be great philosophers and poets and artists at the time. So to have essentially a courtesan interact with these people is something that was seen as normal. So according to Bai Juyi, this integration of art, music, and literature depicted the government courtesan as educated women of the upper social strata. And it was expensive to keep these courtesans around. So according to historian Sun Tc, a peck of rice cost 40 wen, and a roll of silk cost 200 wen. But when you compare them to holding a party at the Pingkang ward, essentially, oops, what happened here? Sorry about that. A party involving courtesans at the Pingkang ward would cost anything from $38,000 to 9,600 wen. So this limited private courtesan ownership to the wealthy or the well-connected members of society. So Baijuyi kind of writes on this that their skills were focused on entertainment, and they were expected to provide due to their expensive upkeep. One jug of fragrant wine, bamboo filter inserted. The little courtesan with twin hair coils sings pretty well. Wind and string instruments have improved since I just taught her. Her netted gauze and white tabby weave silk may be poor, but I need not seek from outside. The world has such a greed for business. It doesn't feel bitterness. In the world of men, if you don't drink, then you are sad. I don't know if you're aware of this. When you are, come with me. So you can see it was a private ownership of house courtesans, when it reached its peak during this time, was encouraged by the throne, highly regarded in society, and well documented by the literati, who had a very romanticized idea of what it was like to own a courtesan. So getting to the Song dynasty, the Song, much like the Tang dynasty before it, kept courtesans as a constant presence in the lives of the Song literati. Realistically, in official business and social affairs, courtesans were present. They were ubiquitous with upper class life, in part because the banquets at which they were present at were an institutional part of government service. So notably, what really arose from this time period were literature and poetry, more so than what we saw in the Tang dynasty. There was this idea that existed that suggested that the ideal Song gentleman, or the ideal man during this era, called the Junzi, was not only an eloquent speaker and a skillful poet, but he was a sensitive man in touch with his emotions. He had a knack for romanticism. And this concept obviously can be traced back to the Tang times, but what we really see here is an encouragement of that through a bunch of literature and poetry. So Ming Shi, in the Song of Poems, wrote an example of this, which said, which was an excerpt essentially espousing the virtues of an educated man and a courtesan woman. The expert reads that the scholar, referring to scholar Han Hun, generally gifted a courtesan to scholar Han Hun. And he said, the scholar is a celebrated literatist at the present time.
Okay, just a quick reminder. Now it's 15 minutes already. Just wrap up in 3 minutes.
Sorry. And she's a celebrated beauty to match a celebrated literati. Isn't this suitable? So this romanticization of the ideal pairing kind of matched the social climate of the courtesan and reinforced the connection that they held with the literati officials. So by the Ming Dynasty, courtesan culture reached the zenith due to a combination of wealth and focus in the finer things. There's overlapping urban areas that contain both publishing as well as courtesan districts. What we saw in the Ming was something called flower registers, which is something quite strange. It was a publication featuring many courtesans of an era, which were ranked and graded and symbolized with a poem or a flower beside her. So two notable publications came during this time: Seductive Courtesans of Suzhou and Seductive Courtesans of Nanjing. And you can almost imagine them as a register, which just graded every single high-ranked courtesan within the city. And these were published across the social sphere, one part to kind of talk about the courtesans of the area, but also to showcase the social skill or the literary skill of the people who presented them. So essentially, the Ming era courtesan was the peak of privilege within the female sphere. They corresponded with gentry, both male and female, and owned and operated property and businesses, much like their male counterparts. They were actually seen as the pinnacles of virtue, and a lot of the correspondence with them came from the upper gentry or gentlewomen who wanted to understand how to become more like them and to learn literary and artistic prose from them. A case study that we have in what the romanticization of the Ming courtesan looks like is in Xue, which was one of the 8 great courtesans of the dynasty. She was exceptionally skilled in a wide variety of arts, and that includes all the common things such as art, like literature, poetry, and singing. But she was also very proficient at horse riding and archery and other more male talents, which provided this kind of androgynous beauty to people who viewed her. And people started referring to her as a female knight errant or a nuxia in Chinese literature. Being representative of Mingji in her era, she had also became an indicator of how strange the social status of courtesans had become essentially by the Ming. So the end of the courtesan essentially occurred after the Ming, when the Qing dynasty came in and started to wear down on the culture. But by then, from a chronological perspective, the courtesans were a cultural oddity. Courtesans were kind of born and existed in the lower fringes of the social ladder, but they interacted with the upper echelons. They promoted themselves not solely through sexual services, but rather an aura of elegance and literary mastery that kind of enabled them to mingle with the upper gentry. The literati would portray them as a mix between seductresses and scholars and companions, which combined beauty, talent, and virtue with a grace that was documented for future generations. Historian Dorothy Coe describes how this paradoxical combination of traits became the new beauty ideal for gentlewomen during the 17th century, which was a palpable irony in how low-born women became inspirations for the high-born.
Okay, great. Thank you for the presentation. Now that's kind of that Alicia start present her paper. Thank you. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. As I get this set up, I'm just going to introduce my paper briefly. It's titled As Strict as Can Be, a comparison of Japan and China's family and social hierarchies pre-1500 era. I wrote this and worked closely with my professor, Dr. Hall, and I am very grateful for his help in making this a really successful paper, I believe. And he really worked closely to help me emphasize today the key aspects of this paper. So I am going to be talking about two books here. And so it's really important that I show us, first we're going to discuss The Dream of the Red Chamber, and we're also discussing The Tale of Genji. And these both, for my presentation, are representations of two different cultures, the cultures of Japan and China. And I just want to emphasize that it is these representations. I would like to, of course, there's different ways that we can look at these two cultures, different evidence that we could saw out, but with comparing these two books for my purposes, I will use the representations that they give us. And I am going to just begin also with defining a few terminologies I think that are really important to my work here. So Neo-Confucianism is the first one. It's a movement in religious philosophy that's derived from Confucianism in China around AD 1000 in response to the ideas of Taoism and Buddhism. And also Confucianism in Japan. So there's many influences from Chinese culture in Japan, including Confucianism, that stands alongside Buddhism as a major religio-philosophical teaching introduced from the larger Asian culture arena at the dawn of civilization in Japan, which is around 501 through 600. My thesis here, and I'm going to continue showing my slides like this just so that I can read my notes here at the bottom. There is an unarguable evidence of Chinese influence within the culture of Japan. With influences from family culture, Confucianism, and bureaucratic government systems, one can see how Chinese culture has had a profound impact on the development of Japanese culture. Looking at a Chinese piece of literature written around the 18th century during the Qing Dynasty, Dream of the Red Chamber by Zhao Kuxian, and a Japanese piece of literature written in the 11th century, The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikubu. It is translated by Edward G. Seidensticker. One can compare instances of family relationships, hierarchy, and the role of power within the respective governments. The social code of the elite is more emphasized in Japan with these representations than in China. While both do have high elite behavior seen throughout the texts, I'm just going to focus on in The Tale of Genji how it can be seen that this social order and hierarchy is stricter. So first, the social code in Japan and China. The aristocratic lives of the court elite in Japan are different, but they are similar. There's going to be many instances of similarities between the two cultures throughout this presentation as well. The main difference that I want to draw upon is how the social code of the noble class in Japan is stricter. First, beginning with The Dream of the Red Chamber, which for my instance is showing China's culture. It exemplifies the difference in China's family and social hierarchy, which is not as emphasized because it would eventually collapse from insubordination of servants that cause tension between the differing levels of social hierarchy. But then contrastingly in The Tale of Genji, which is my representation of Japanese culture, there are many instances where those in the noble elite are not even aware of the reality outside of their elite lives, which in my paper, this is exemplified as showing the strictness. If you're not even aware of the social classes around you, that shows a really strict distinction between them. This is an example of the strict distinction and of the strictness in their social hierarchies. Next, the patriarchal systems in these two different texts are also evidence of this difference in strictness. So in the text, The Dream of the Red Chamber, it focuses a lot on corruption, decline, and eventually the regeneration of power from a family living in the Yugofa mansions. The mansions are the residence of senior lineage, and Chen is the male head of the mansion. But in the text, it discusses many women who run the household as well. So this instance of family hierarchy is different than in Japan, which would be more a traditional patriarchal system, where one would assume that gender roles are strictly within the power to the men, not within any instances of women having power. And in the Tale of Genshi, it is the Fujiwara family who have, they've intermarried within the imperial family. They don't really like how Genshi actually even goes against the system in the Heian society's values of very serious, rational behavior of men. This is something that Genshi openly dismisses himself. He even states at one point, in the most important matter, the matter of running his household, it's the man that runs the house. And so this idea, again, it's the men in this traditional patriarchal system. One difference between their two hierarchical systems there. And, within the Dream of the Red Chamber, allowing women, that also can be used as an argument that Japan is stricter since they don't have as much allowance for women to have power as it is seen in the Dream of the Red Chamber. So one must also continuously display their wealth within the Chinese social hierarchical system, which is evident in many examples throughout the text where they attend funerals. They try to be charitable to other families when they can, just to say like, hey, I have this power, so I'm going to give some help to those that are the lower classes. For example, Phoenix in the text secures her position by her effectiveness, which is on good terms to those elders who do have power. In China's one's status is based heavily in merit and achievements, especially with an imperial test. So that's a big emphasis of the book in The Dream of the Red Chamber. One will even lose their societal status if they're found to be corrupt. And at any point, someone can lose their position in the hierarchy. In turn, they would lose their reputation that they've built by doing all these assignments. And we'll see how that is different in Japan's system. Because they, in the text, are represented in a way that is maybe negative within being lazy or slower paced. So this laziness and slow paced, which is maybe in a more positive ways described as the aesthetic. So they are focused more on the aesthetic, not the practical, like the practical in the Dream of the Red Chamber of those tasks. One must uphold their aesthetic. They are not really caring as much about corruption. In the Tale of Genshi, there's an instance of vanity over merit leading people to power. Koremitsu once even described Genshi as undeniably someone the whole world took seriously, his youth, and the fact that women found him attractive. Again, this attractiveness that might not have been as evident in a merit system. This leads one to think of outward appearance being the basis for power, and those in Japan care more about aesthetics. And in the nature, in this text, they elaborate livelihood as seen as an achievement of one's ethics as well. I'll talk soon about, they write poems is a big part of this aesthetic. And the court was busy with ceremonies and displays, or in Genshi's case, with adventures. He had many adventures throughout the book. His adventures and love stories show, he is educated in his aesthetic values. And then he even has just many instances where he is seeking women to marry. This will just, again, leads us to see the focus on the aesthetic. And then again, back to the separation between classes. So there's not much tell of hardships of commoners in the Tale of Genshi. Those in the elite are, it says foolishly unaware of what is going on around them. It shows that they are strict between the separation in classes, but those in the Chinese court standards, like I said, with these poems, the poems might not have been as evident in Chinese culture as something as showing power. In Japan's, they would judge someone on their caliber to write poetry. And it is a form of communication even that the book discusses, and it really shows emotions through their poetry. It shows how their intellect, it leads them to be favored if they can show their intellect through these poems. And it's just really expected at the courts that one's status in everyday court hierarchy is judged by one's composition of poems. Specifically in Zhenqi's case, he's a skilled poem composer and is highly respected at the imperial court for the poems he writes. The reputation one lives outwardly is important. So this outward representation in poems. For example, Zhenqi engages in many flings and affairs, but he keeps them secret because he doesn't want to become fodder for gossip. Again, this outward representation of him would be within the gossip. So the text does say, Zhenqi did not want gossip at this late date, and he's avoiding the court, disapproving of him. So even though he does contradict many of their ideals, he still doesn't really want to be disapproved of. And then another example of this is how Zhenqi's father-in-law grows resentful of his neglect of his wife, and as he is seeing other women other than his wife, and he still just makes sure, though, even though he is doing one thing wrong, seeing other women, he wants to still wear what he's supposed to wear. And even though he might not become the emperor, or he's not the heir of the emperor, he just still really values his high status in the court. So, and this is going back to the charity, which shows, again, less separation between classes in Chinese culture. So the family hierarchy is in place with Madame Wang as the head woman and her daughter-in-law Phoenix. This is in The Dream of the Red Chamber. They are able to run day-by-day endeavors of the household as managers and watchdogs. And they do still need permission, though, of those higher up. And this is just showing that it's an example of hierarchy and power within the richer families, helping those of subordinate branches. They may help those lower than them as a sign of their own wealth. So Phoenix gives a speech to Winlo, but she's unsuccessful in getting this charity from Winlo's family because Winlo says they are too distantly related and the family members are lazy. So again, this laziness is not tolerated in China's culture, and even though it is in Japan's aristocratic lives and their court elite before 1500. So it is just really showing again that the high class, the poetry in Japan is really important. And then in China, laziness is not allowed. And that is how someone wasn't able to get charity, and then there's also just this idea of linkages between members, as Winlo discusses her distance to Phoenix's family. And this family ties is really important throughout both these texts as well. So in China's social hierarchy as well, they have to be recommended to do tasks. So having reputations and these links and showing that you're not lazy is just going to keep adding up in your favor for being recommended for even more tasks. And it's really important, what can the people do on the court's behalf? So these high cultural attainment is just different again than what we'll see in the representation of Japan's court society. So here in Japan's court society, there is a really strict structure, and even when someone does have favoritism or does have someone that they would wish to be up higher in the social status, it might not be able to occur. This aspect of the social hierarchy goes to great lengths to keep the structure. In The Tale of Zhenqi, which is my representation of Japan's culture, it is heavily discussed how, Zhenqi is not always proper within the society that values things being rational and balanced. And his mother even ends up suffering because she's a lower rank within being the emperor's concubine, not his wife. And we did learn a little bit about concubines, which I think was helpful. And even though she was Zhenqi's father's favorite concubine, she was not promoted, or she was not highly regarded as the emperor's wife would be in the eyes of public. And it is said in the text that this is what led to her death. And her death shows how cruelty and competition can really just break someone down to the last straw. And she had many opponents, and I'll discuss at one point her place of living was really far from the emperor. So as the emperor would walk to where Zhenqi's mother lived, they would all just judge him and judge her throughout just it being so far from his own place of living. And then this idea of absolute rulers comes in as well. So in the Fujiwara clan, they have great power, and in Chinese culture, they most generally show rulers having absolute power rather than this sharing of power. The Dream of the Red Chamber is more focused on issues of relationships at the court, especially in the court chamber and the closure of society within the court. In the text, it is the imperial court that makes political and societal determinations, and one must be aligned with the state. So, for example, the local family males of the court have been found guilty of corruption in their transactions, and this really led to, them being jailed and cut off from court privileges. And, this vitality of the family needing to regain their position is really seen throughout the text, The Dream of the Red Chamber, and it's really the whole focal point. But in contrast, in the Chiao-Jinchi, it is not the emperor making decisions, it's the Fujiwara family who make the determinations, and the people don't really want to mess with that, and they don't want to break social order. As we saw with Genshi's mother passing, that could be a consequence. And
okay, quickly reminder, it's 15 minutes, just wrap up in 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. So people worry about the court's reaction, and it says at court, everyone would be frantic. And so in Genshi's interests, he is really interested in women throughout the text, but maybe not as much about breaking the court's reaction. So I'm going to go through these last slides a little bit quicker. There's, examples of differences in punishment, as well as we see in China's text, their servants, and I'm talking here about would then have spared your master in his fit of anger. So it's saying how she's serving him really faithfully. So even though she's doing her best, he still is punishing her. And so it's just showing this conclusion that females do not have the ability to have power in both cultural hierarchies, or this instance. Back to the idea of female concubines. And, as earlier I discussed, Lady Kiritsubu, she has the pair pavilion, which I said is the farthest location. So I've already discussed this idea that in Japan's court culture, the women's lower status is really emphasized, and contrasting in The Dream of the Red Chamber, Cardinal Spring was able to become a royal concubine and was able to regain some power for her family. So this is really a difference between Cardinal Spring, who is able to have power and able to gain reputation for her family, versus Lady Kiritsubu, who, even though she was the favorite, she could not do that, within Japan's really strict social hierarchy. And, this is again talking about Cardinal Spring's ability to become a grand tutor. She's able to take these tasks and tests to bring more reputation to her family. Then discussing men in the books, Zhai Baiyu is the male hero of the Dream Red Chamber, and he is seen also needing to pass tests. And this is contrasting to Genshi, who he is more focused on marriage and linking lineages is within the strict Japanese culture, because they might even marry their own aunt in this instance to have a base for prominence in the court. So those are the men as examples for differences in strictness. And then even they had limited freedom. So while those in the Dream of the Red Chamber focus more on regaining their family status, Phoenix helps rise the family's fortunes. And, it's even limited for Zhai Baiyu, as he's not permitted to marry Black Jade because it would not be the smartest tactic. So again, this idea that there's tactics, there's thinking constantly, how can we regain our representation within China's culture that we really do not see in the Tale of Genshi. So this distinction of the relationship shows how family hierarchy linkage to the Imperial is similarly important in both texts, but again is stricter in the Tale of Genshi. And lastly, I would like to conclude that there's comparisons and contrasts between the two cultures pre-1500 that show the differing levels of strictness in the hierarchy of social and family within the Tale of Genshi and the Dream of the Red Chamber. Historically, Japan has even been able to be more strict in their hierarchy, as I can show here. We have this small green isolated island in comparison to the large red area of China. This is just connecting to modern times, that China may not have been able to keep their strict hierarchy as reflected in these texts due to the larger land reach that it has and the greater societal expansion it has created. So within modern times, communist China has broken away more from this traditional societal hierarchy in more ways, but Japan, in contrast, has been able to uphold a feudalist court-based societal hierarchy. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for all the fascinating, great presentations. So I realized I forgot to introduce myself. So I am Dr. Shiau-Yun Chen. I teach East Asian history in history department at Boston. My research specialty focus on violence committed by women from the 14th to 16th century. So my specialty is gender history and legal history. Now I will give some general comments to and specific comments to each paper. During this time period, attendees, please use the function of Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom webinar to pose your question to the panelists. And then after my comments, and what we will, each panelist will answer the questions together. Okay. The three panelists demonstrate different historical thinking skills in their paper. McKenna examined and compared multiple kinds of historical sources, including official documents, personal diaries, paintings, and will and testimony to analyze the nature of Cassare as a social practice. JunRu synthesizes actually a lot of secondary scholarship on courtesan and courtesan culture from 9th to 17th centuries to show the commonality and changes of courtesan and courtesan culture. Alicia analyzes literature, including one Japanese novel and one Chinese novel, and compare the two cases to show the significances of family and social hierarchies between Chinese and Japanese societies before 1500. Three panelists show different methodologies during history and provide different perspectives for us to think about marriage and family in different culture. And now I want to give questions and comments to each panelist. McKenna examines the nature of quote-unquote marriage custom, Cassare in 19th century Danish colony in Africa, by analyzing multiple sources and comparing two cases of Cassare. Her conclusion seems to suggest that the complexity of such custom is the reason why historians today still haven't reached an agreement on the nature of the custom. McKenna concludes in her paper, quote, this is her word, quote, how one chooses to categorize these relationships comes down to a case-by-case scenario and how one chooses to look at the evidence, unquote. This conclusion reveals the complicated and hybrid nature of the custom Cassare and provides readers an open-ended result to understand and evaluate such custom. This paper has shown a lot of potential to open a conversation with the scholarship. So I will recommend adding your own definition of marriage in this paper. This definition will definitely help your reader better evaluate the custom. I know the definition, as you state, it's very difficult, but with your own definition based on the evidence, it will be easier for you to have a conversation with the current scholarship. I also want to point out that there seems to have a consistent pattern in the sources that McKenna examined. For sources that are accessible to the European reader, so-called public sources, such as official documents, painting, and correspondence to the European families, the image of African women will be deliberately depicted as exotic and subordinate to European men and women. Men will even present themselves as detached and aloof to not only African women, but also Africa itself as a colony. So in contrast, in sources that are considered a more personal sources, such as diaries and the wills and testimonies, men express their attachment to African women. So what historical significances can be observed from such differences? I'm also curious about if Cassare is a legal term or a social term. If Cassare is a legal term, it suggests that such quasi-marriage requires more responsibilities. If that's the case, what kind of legal responsibilities that kind of consider as a legal obligation? So if the term is more of a social term for a new social custom described kind of significant in that specific historical moment. And this kind of social term is used to describe the union between a European man and an African woman at the time. I wonder if the local community asked these European colonizers behaved and respect the local marriage custom at the time. So was Cassare considered a new custom that completely differed from the local marital custom? If that is the case, how did women in Cassare relationship were viewed by other women follow the local marital customs? So that's my comment and questions for for McKenna's paper. So JunRu's paper deal with Chinese courtesans and courtesan culture from Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. JunRu synthesizes different scholars' research dealing with the topic of courtesan and focus on the ambiguous nature of courtesans. On the one hand, legally and socially, courtesans were considered as not just people in lower social class, but people who were considered as a class of debased people. Such debased people could be was actually very similar to the concept of outcast. However, on the other hand, we can see courtesans were trained to entertain scholars and literates, and courtesans got a chance to hang out with important political and social figures. Courtesans provide not only sexual service, but also companionship and emotional attachment, emotional attraction to scholars, literati, and politicians. JunRu did a great job describing how courtesans interact with men in different dynasties. However, I would recommend adding more social and cultural context, specifying significant historical changes from the Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasty. The definition of literati and scholars, for example, changed significantly from the Tang to Ming dynasty. The courtesan culture, which was closely related to literati and scholars, changed as well. Courtesan culture shifted from focusing on aristocracy and political figures to focusing on merchants and literati who could not pass civil service examination and found comfort and solace in creating literature, art, and other cultural activities in the Ming dynasty. So specify such changes will not only provide readers changes in courtesan culture, but also provide deeper understanding of changes in social structure in Imperial China. So Alicia's paper compares a Japanese novel to a Chinese novel in order to examine the familial and social hierarchies pre-1500 era. So this paper examines details from the two novels and compare the situation in China and the situation in Japan in order to see significances in the two societies. So I think this paper did a great job diagnosing patterns about family and social hierarchies. However, I still would recommend providing analysis of the two sources because these two sources are both literatures. Therefore, to what extent the description from the two novels are historical truths or literary expressions are in need of fuller examination. So I also want to point out that given the fact that Dream of the Red Chamber was written in the 18th century and the Tale of Kenji was written in the 11th century, how were these two texts demonstrate the historical experience pre-1500? Adding an analysis of contextualization of these two texts would help clarify this issue. Such analysis will also clarify the assumption that societies didn't change before the 16th centuries. Finally, I want to point out that the Tale of Kenji describes imperial members' lives in the court. In contrast, Dream of the Red Chambers describes an official's family life. Did the different sets of rules about family and social hierarchies appeared in the sources because these novels were essentially talking about two different kinds of families, familial lives like imperial life and official's life, or because these two can actually represent differences in Chinese and Japanese societies. So clarify this point will also help the reader fully understand familial and social changes at a time. So can the panelists see the questions? Okay, so because of time, I want to give each panelist like 3 minutes to quickly answer comments and questions, and then we will have a general discussion by the end. So we have to finish before 2:30. Okay, Maxine, please. Also, McKenna, please.
So I'm gonna answer the one of your questions, which was about if this was a social or a legal term. Cassares was definitely social. There's nothing legally binding these marriages together. They were Christian marriages as well. So a lot of the times I think it was Wolf was Jewish. So this was very taboo for him to go to Africa and join like a Christian marriage, but it was not legalized through anything through the Netherlands. And a lot of times when they would when they would go back to the Netherlands, like if they went with people like on the same boat, they'd be like, I won't talk about your Cassare wife if you won't talk about my Cassare wife, because it was very taboo. And so they were like, nope, what happens in Africa stays in Africa, like Vegas. And then to answer Dr. Etchison's question, which was in the United States, it was common to blame interracial marriage on African American women who are depicted as tempting white men. Do you see the same sexualization of African women to excuse these Cassare marriages? So not really. What was happening in these Cassare marriages? So for example, Carstensen went to Africa and stayed with Wolf, and he learned, like a lot of the times they didn't know what a Cassare marriage was before they went to the coast, and then they would stay with higher officials who had been there who were in these relationships, and it became, once you got there, an expected tradition. It was something that helped you, like when you were sick. It gave you a companion because you would be there for months or years, and it was a female companion to have not only sex with, but also an emotional connection. So that was something that was very important to them while they were on the coast. It helped them a lot socially, economically, and other things. But it wasn't like, oh, she tempted me. It was like, oh, this is something that I am beneficially gaining from while also having a friend there. So that's kind of like to answer your question, but like it wasn't like a taboo thing to have that marriage while you were there, just while you were back in Europe.
Okay, great. Now, why don't JunRu kind of respond to our comments and questions?
Yeah, I'm going to answer Dr. Etchinson's question first of how does someone essentially become a courtesan, because I think that's a really great question. One of the key ideas that we've mentioned before is under this Confucianist ideology, women were worth less than their male counterparts. So a lot of these families, so there's a type of like the social condition where women are worth less, but you're also encouraged to have a large family. So a lot of what we saw was essentially a parental abandonment of a lot of their female children, because simply put, if you were poor, you couldn't afford to raise all these children that you essentially had. So a lot of these lower class women were actually, for lack of a better word, sold to these specialty houses, essentially, that kind of trained them. And obviously I would even use the term groom from a modern context, because you're raising these very young girls, these sometimes prepubescent girls, to become courtesans and concubines, and a lot of this just depended on the aptitude of the specific girl. They were generally just selected for a certain aptitude, and to become a courtesan or a concubine, and then trained, and then eventually sent out to either the imperial courts or private ownership, very reminiscent of indentured servitude, under severe contract terms. So it was not something that in the modern day we would see as morally permissible, but for that time span it was seen as a legitimate industry. And realistically, the harsh reality of it was that if you weren't picked up, like if your parents abandoned you or if you were sold to a buyer, there really wasn't another way to make a living as a young girl. You wouldn't really be hired by anyone else. So it's either the harsh life of training to become a courtesan, or you become a homeless or refuge on the streets. Essentially, like you would have to take refuge on the streets and hope that someone would take pity on you. So it was not a good time to be a woman at this time.
Okay, so Alicia.
Thank you. So I wanted to address your concerns, Dr. Chen, at first. So you just did discuss, some analysis of the two different texts and just some clarifications that were necessary. So for those purposes, in the class Asian Civilizations, I wrote this paper for. Our task was to compare and contrast the aristocratic lives of the court elite in pre-1200 Japan to the elite of traditional China. And we were assigned these two novels. So I believe if I were to, go more in depth with this, like you said, I would have shown some of those discrepancies, within, as you said, the differences with one family being an imperial family and one family being a court family. Again, I'd also go more in depth to analyze some historical, maybe some primary sources from both of the cultures rather than two fictional novels. And it is just more of an overall comparison of the two novels that I chose to draw upon rather than, within the representations, rather than a comparison of the true nature that those in pre-1500 Chinese in Japan maybe have lived through. It was mostly just, the basis between a way to understand some really popular work in the two countries side by side rather than critique or a criticism or a look at Japan and China at the time. So I hope that clears that up. And then with the question from Dr. Etchinson, I'd love to, touch upon the fact that, Chinese and Japanese women could shape their own lives in these hierarchical societies represented in the textbooks. They had some strategies to gain more control. So for example, in the Tale of Genji, for the case of the Akashi lady, she was a humble woman and she was having relations with Genji, and her relations were within the purpose to elevate her own status to a court lady. So this is actually a rare case in this text with his promise to her to, help her within the court. And it was just something that the Akashi lady was wanting to gain more power, despite her life where she was born to be more disadvantaged. She was raised outside of the city. So her example is just one that I think answers your question well, Dr. Etchison, for the women in Japan. And then for, just to reiterate, the representation of Chinese culture that I discussed in the Dream of the Red Chamber for women shaping their own lives and gaining more power, I used the example of Cardinal Spring or Phoenix. So I wanted to, look back at in my paper, I talked about how she was able to gain material and social status through being promoted to the rank of Grand Tutor, through doing tasks and taking tests. And she just had that capability within the court in that text. So I think those were just two examples in those texts for your question. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. So now why don't all the panelists kind of see if you have any question to each other or comments in the meantime. If there's more questions from the attendees, just use the Q&A function. I just want to kind of emphasize again, you all did a great jobs on your paper, but of course, I do have to kind of pick, kind of, try to give some comments. Otherwise, I will say that your paper is already very kind of complete already. So
I greatly appreciated your comments because I am very interested in, the popularity of these two texts. And as JunRu told us at the beginning, he's even read both of them. So I don't know if he has any insight based on his readings of them for my paper, but I really appreciated your comments.
Yeah, I mean, it's very succinctly well written. I think it's difficult to kind of separate the Neo-Confucian influence in both of them, right? It's just I just think that, I've studied a lot of Japanese history, and they just have a very subtle way to kind of take foreign ideas and integrate themselves within Japanese culture. So you can see the tale of Genji as kind of their social take, right? I actually had a question for McKenna. The Cassare, Cassare?
Cassare.
Cassare, thank you. Is that a Danish word?
It's actually derived from the French. The French also had a similar marriage type social hierarchy thing in their colonies. And you can actually see this along the entire western coast of Africa. Maybe not like with words for them, but they definitely were there. And it was just the most prevalent of my research in the Danish. Oh my goodness, my brain. The Danish coast on the Gold Coast. And they weren't there for very long either. They ended up kind of like going bankrupt, and they couldn't support their colonies on the Gold Coast anymore. So they ended up like selling it to the French and the British. So that was kind of why the Prince of Joinville and that painting was at the luncheon. They took over a lot of the Danish forts and land because the Danish could not support having colonies in Africa anymore.
Oh, yeah, because I was just kind of curious, because it's very easy to draw up those kind of, because you always wonder, like, from a position of power, right? Can you really say that this marriage was a sanctified marriage, and it wasn't like a moment of a proposition of lust or just circumstance? So kind of hard to tell, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, and there's not any, at least not that I could find, any sources from the women themselves. So everything that historians have to go off of is in the European viewpoint. So you do have to take those for a grain of salt. Like, they have validity in them, but you have to be able to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, what in this source might be biased? What can we kind of take from this that's also in another source from a Danish man talking about it as well. So that was why I was trying to compare the two relationships, because being able to look at their sources and derive like from the similarities in them, I could see more like what historically probably was the trueness of the relationships themselves, rather than just looking at one side of the story from one person.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I also realized that really quickly. I forgot to mention one of Dr. Chen's questions. My bad. The brain's kind of getting fried. But in terms of like different literaties between the various, like, obviously, I know we said like the Song Tang, you had Ming, where like I mentioned them very briefly, but you have to realize that, like, this was a span of almost 1,000 years, right? I think what it speaks to, obviously, you're going to see changes in scholarship and society between that time, but I think what really stands is why the courtesans within China was such a curious case, is because for essentially 1,000 years, and if even more so before Imperial China, they were widely used. Like, this was a caste of people who had existed longer than most contemporary European countries. So that fact in by itself is just something that really showcases like the time span of how entrenched this tradition was. It wasn't really a passing fad. It was something that was built into the core of old Chinese society, at least until the Republic and along that.
Great. Okay. So I think it's time that we finish our panel, but we can have this conversation through emails or other channels. Thank you again for the great presentation and the 3 papers. Thank you very much.